I think of the media as a bustling marketplace of ideas, clamoring for our attention. We're lucky in this country to have agency over which sources we go to for our news, just like we have agency over which booths to visit at a market. And the marketplace metaphor is appropriate in that our attention is a form of currency. All the vendors in the market want us to spend our attention on them. But just like our grocery budgets for the week, we have a finite amount of attention, so we need to spend it wisely. I'm Amber Boydston, a professor of political science, and I study media and politics. And when I tell people that, usually the first thing they want to ask me about, or rather tell me about, is polarization in the media. When my mom and I travel together, we have an understanding that if I get caught in a conversation with someone who, while lovely, ends up venting at me about media polarization, my mom will graciously steer the conversation to a different topic. But later, as soon as we're alone, she'll often say, "But it does seem so polarized." And I get it. It's as though you go to the market and see that it's bread week. All the booths are selling bread as their top item. Some are selling it in the form of whole wheat bread, some in the form of gluten-free bread, some in the form of donuts, or rather 280-character bite-sized donut holes. And people who shop at different booths are walking away with a totally different understanding of what bread is. When someone who's only tried the gluten-free bread chats with someone who's only tried the donuts, no wonder they can't agree. Are donuts even bread? I don't know. But it strikes me that polarization is a facet of media and politics that we, you, me, my mom, all of us, were already thinking about. Today, I want to talk about a different facet of the media marketplace because I'm guessing that even though you're already aware of it, you're not monitoring it as closely. And in my opinion, it's just as important, if not more important, than media polarization. Here it is. When we go to the market, the things we see for sale are not necessarily representative of the bigger picture. There are probably lots of items, apples, carrots, watermelon, that also deserve at least a week's worth of our attention currency, but for various reasons have little or no representation in the market. Also, just because it's bread week this week, it doesn't mean that bread is suddenly more important than it was last week, or that next week, when it's not bread week anymore, it will be less important. I'm going to shift from talking about groceries to talking about news items, and here, of course, is where the metaphor breaks down, because the items in the news are so much more important than loaves of bread. But first, let's take a moment to think about how news outlets work. There's not a man behind the curtain, or a woman either. In outlets like the Chicago Tribune, pictured here in 2016, there are lots of individual journalists, most of them working really hard to try to fill the media marketplace with high-quality stories about the most pressing issues out there. But they're making these choices about what to cover and how to cover it based in a system of institutional incentives against the current political landscape and with lots of feedback from us, their customers. And even the best of us is going to cave sometimes and buy donuts because they're delicious. The result of all of these individual journalistic choices is not news that fluctuates gradually in tandem with how pressing or severe the underlying issues are. Rather, the result is a pattern of media coverage that changes explosively. Most issues, most of the time, come and go in the news quickly with just a story here or there. But sometimes, when the right political stars align, media coverage of an idea or an issue can explode into what co-authors Walgrave, Hardy, Vliegenthaert, and I call a media storm. And the issues at the center of those media storms end up getting the lion's share of attention. We define media storms empirically in more precise detail, but the basic intuition is that a media storm is a sudden surge in coverage at a high volume, meaning most people in the country are aware of it regardless of where they get their news, and it lasts for at least a week. Now, only about 10% of news stories meet the criteria of being part of a media storm. But those media storms are big enough, loud enough to break through all the rest of the noise and to lodge in our minds. They can change the way we think about the world, they can be catalysts for action. For example, in 2002, a media storm erupted around the systemic sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests. This media storm was triggered by a series of Boston Globe articles based on years of investigative journalism. Of all of the alleged incidents of abuse over the preceding 50 years, less than 1% occurred in 2002, the year the story broke. Yet nearly a third of the survivors from those preceding 50 years came forward in 2002 alone, suggesting that the media storm wasn't just big enough to capture our attention. It was big enough to prompt a tipping point of social norms, lessening the stigma for survivors. So what determines which news items become media storms and which don't? Well, it's the same kinds of things that help determine whether or not an individual story is newsworthy. For example, geographical proximity to a news outlet's audience can help a news item become a media storm. Consider US news coverage of Hurricane Katrina compared to two other far more deadly natural disasters. Following Katrina, we see a classic media storm, a sudden surge of attention that saturates the media landscape, lasting for several weeks before dying down. For the other two, we see an increase in coverage and then a slow decay, but with nowhere near the volume of coverage or the explosiveness that we see in a media storm. For Katrina, it was the geographical proximity that fed the media storm, not the devastation of the hurricane itself, as tragic as that was. In my analysis of the last several decades of news coverage, here's what I've learned. There are necessary conditions for a news item to become a media storm, but only rarely are those conditions jointly sufficient. In order for a news item to become a media storm, it needs to satisfy at least two of these three conditions. But even if it satisfies all three, that's no guarantee. It needs to be the right kind of item, meaning it needs to be a sudden event or the discovery of shocking information that's either tragic or sensational, and it helps to have dramatic photos or video. It needs to be talked about in the right kind of way, meaning news coverage that focuses either on vilifying someone or, more rarely, on exalting someone, and it helps to have acknowledgement of the problem by high-profile people like politicians or celebrities. And it needs to hit at the right time to catch fire, meaning it needs to have momentum, either from previous similar news items and/or from social media or local media. This last condition is especially tricky because if we stop and think about it, there are so many media storms we've experienced that almost didn't happen. Take the media storm that followed the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. That media storm was anything but predictable. Had it not been for the graphic video, we almost surely would not know George Floyd's name. But even with the video, it's not at all clear that we would have seen a resulting media storm had the general American public not already been primed to recognize the concept of police use of deadly force, in part through the media storm that followed the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And check this out. Michael Brown's death helped galvanize the Black Lives Matter movement. But those words, that hashtag Black Lives Matter, they were coined more than a year earlier when George Zimmerman was acquitted in the killing of Trayvon Martin. And the media storm that followed Trayvon Martin's death didn't happen until 2 weeks after his death. And then national news outlets only picked up the story because it had gotten so much traction on social media following local news coverage by outlets like the Miami Herald. And then it helped that it was a relatively slow news week. So many stars had to align for each of these media storms to happen. And if one of the first two hadn't happened, it's possible the third wouldn't have either. What I'm saying is that the deaths of these three men, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, George Floyd, we could have missed them. And if we could have missed knowing about them, what else might we be missing? That's what keeps me up at night and what I want to talk about with strangers when I'm traveling and they ask me about my research. All the other important issues and ideas that we're not paying attention to because their stars haven't aligned to create a media storm. The flip side of this concern, of course, is that when important issues get much needed attention in the form of media storms, those storms suck up so much of the oxygen in the media environment that other important issues can get missed instead. As just one example, think about the problem of wildfires in California, and let's compare last year to this. In the first 3 months of 2020, 1,200 acres in California had burned. In the same time this year, we've seen nearly 7 times that amount. But the news coverage doesn't track it. Last year, looking at US newspaper coverage of California wildfires, the coverage was a little bit more than it's been this year. And in the local Sacramento Bee, the difference is even greater. So arguably, the problem of wildfires is bigger this year than it was last, but that's not being reflected in the media, in part because the media agenda has been so consumed with other big issues so far in 2021 that totally deserve our attention. And also, there's tragically not much new or surprising about wildfires. This disconnect between the urgency of the problem and how much attention it gets in the news is playing out on an even bigger scale for climate change. To sum up, media storms are powerful, and in a big way, they're really good for society because they almost always shine the spotlight on really important issues that we otherwise might have missed, like police use of deadly force or child sexual abuse. And yet, there are at least 3 dangers to living in a world where media storms are an ingrained pattern in the news. First, they can crowd out other important issues. Again, what else are we missing because we're so consumed with the news of the week? Second, the dynamics of media storms are explosive, and those explosive dynamics can lead people to think incorrectly that when a media storm has died down, that the issue has been resolved. Think back to last fall, to fall of 2020, when media attention about police use of deadly force had died down. It didn't mean the problem had been fixed. And third, bringing it back to polarization that I mentioned at the beginning, media storms tend to be long enough that they give different political factions enough time to crystallize a messaging campaign around the underlying issues, potentially contributing to our perception of polarization and maybe even to polarization itself. So what do we do? Well, you're probably already doing these things, but here are 3 tips to tell your friends, and they're all about diversifying our news consumption. First, I suggest staying away from news aggregators because they'll predominantly amplify media storms that, while important, you're probably not at risk of missing. Instead, look to trusted news sources, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, places like that. But don't just read the front page or the home page. Instead, go digging for stories on lower display shelves because they might be just as important. Second, consider diversifying your news outlets. Every once in a while, check in with MSNBC and Fox News just to see what they're saying. Think about sources like Politico or The Hill that don't follow the traditional business model of the legacy media, but offer a wider variety of perspectives. And consider watching news TV shows like 60 Minutes or Frontline. If you like social media, then that's great, you enjoy it. Just remember that your Twitter and Facebook feeds are specifically expertly curated to feed you information that reinforces your view of the world. Third, and I cannot stress this point enough, subscribe to your local newspaper. And if you can afford it, subscribe to a different local newspaper. If you love Davis, California, then no matter where you live, subscribe to the Davis Enterprise. The ideas and policy issues at the heart of a community are increasingly only available at the local newspaper booth. Is the booth a little odd? Yes. Does it maybe only print 2 or 3 hard copy papers a week because of decreasing revenues? Yes. Does it maybe sometimes inexplicably forget to include the crossword puzzle? Yes. Are local newspapers critical to the health and survival of our democracy? Absolutely. So go subscribe. Thank you.